On November 2nd, 1917, Britain's Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, wrote a letter that would set off a conflict still being fought more than 100 years later.
His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object.
When Balfour wrote of his government's intent to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine, 90% of the people living there were not Jewish. Just 31 years later, most of them were gone.
여기서 얼마나 많은 사람들을 죽이셨죠? 세어보진 않았어요. 알 수가 없죠.
היה לי מקלע עם 250 כדורים.
250발이 든 머신건이 있었거든요.
This is the story of the British promise that led to the destruction of Palestine and the creation of the State of Israel. Let's start with the obvious question. Why were the British making promises about other people's
영국은 왜 자기 나라도 아닌데 그런 약속을 했을까요?
countries? Short answer, empire is one hell of a drug.
제국주의는 마약처럼 끊을 수가 없습니다.
This was World War I, and the British were making lots of promises. In addition to promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine, they promised Arab leaders independence if they rose up against Britain's enemy, the Ottoman Empire.
그때는 제1차 세계대전 중이었고 영국은 약속을 남발 중이었죠. 유대인들에게는 팔레스타인 땅을 주겠다고 약속함과 동시에 아랍인들에게는 영국의 적인 오스만 제국에 맞서 일어나면은 독립을 약속하겠다고도 했습니다.
The Arabs did. Hollywood
아랍인들은 그래서 봉기했죠.
even made a movie about it.
Arabia's for the Arabs now. That's what I've told them anyway. That's what they think. That's why they're fighting.
Oh, surely.
A month after Balfour's letter, British troops took Palestine, ending 400 years of Ottoman rule. The people who lived there were Arabs, mostly Muslims, but there were Christian and Jewish minorities.
그곳에 살던 사람들은 주로 아랍인들이었고 대부분 무슬림이었습니다. 하지만 거기에도 소수의 기독교인들과 유대인들이 있었죠.
Too. There was also a tiny number of European Jews who in the late 1800s had started building small colonies there. At a time when many Jews were suffering horrific persecution in Europe, they felt Palestine could be an escape. The idea of building up a Jewish presence in Palestine became known as Zionism, but it stayed a fringe movement among European Jews.
유대 나라를 팔레스타인에 세우려는 생각은 시오니즘으로 알려져 있었지만 유럽 유대인들에게는 인기가 없었습니다.
Many of them felt they shouldn't have to leave their countries to avoid persecution.
대부분의 유대인들이 박해를 피하기 위해 굳이 있던 곳을 떠나야 되나 하고 생각했죠.
But Zionism as a political movement took a big step forward with an Austrian man called Theodor Herzl.
하지만 시오니즘을 정치적으로 이용하려 했던 테오도르 헤르츠리라는 오스트리아 사람에 의해 이는 큰 진전을 이룹니다.
And this guy is a very important name in this story. In 1896, he published Der Judenstaat, or in English, the Jewish State.
1896년 그는 유든스타트, 영어로는 유대인 국가라는 책을 출간합니다.
In it, he said the only way for Jews to avoid Europe's anti-Semitism was not just to leave, but to have their own country. And Herzl didn't just write. The next year, he organized a conference in Basel, Switzerland, the first Zionist Congress.
다음 해에 그는 스위스 바젤에서 첫 번째로 시온주의 의회를 구성했습니다.
The attendees agreed on a program which sought, among other things, to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine and promote Jewish settlement in Palestine. From here on out, the Zionist movement became very active, setting up funds to promote Jewish immigration to Palestine, companies to buy land there, and recruiting representatives to advocate for their cause with different governments. A few days after the conference, Herzl wrote this in his diary.
At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50 years, everyone will perceive it.
바젤에서 나는 유대인 국가를 설립했다. 5년 정도만 지나면 확실하게는 50년 정도만 지나면 모든 사람이 그것을 받아들이게 될 것이다.
He was only off by 1 year.
50년이 아니라 51년이 걸렸으니 1년 정도만 빗나간 셈이죠.
Okay, so that is a lot of history, but it's important because the Zionist movement is a critical part of the story going forward, especially after it found a friend in the British government, where a lot of high-ranking officials supported Zionism, sometimes for unexpected reasons.
영국 정부가 이러한 운동을 지지한 이후로 많은 영국 정부의 고위 관료들이 정말 예상하지도 못한 이유로 시오니즘을 지지하게 되었습니다.
Prime Minister Lloyd George, for example, was a Christian zealot who believed gathering the Jewish people in Palestine would bring Jesus Christ back to earth. Others, like Balfour, believed that getting the Jewish people out of Europe and into their own country would be a good thing. Herzl was pretty visionary when he wrote that the anti-Semitic nations will become our allies. Meanwhile, the Zionists assured Britain that their future country would be a reliable ally.
한편 시오니스트들은 영국이 미래에 그들이 믿을 만한 동맹이 되어줄 거라 믿어 의심치 않았죠.
So that's the backstory of how European anti-Semitism, Zionism, and British imperialism all led to the Balfour Declaration, this British promise to build a homeland for Jews in Palestine. Now we're going to look at how Britain did that. World War I had been a conflict between rival empires, and the winner set up the League of Nations to distribute the losing side's territories between them. They called it the Mandate System, putting territories once controlled by the Ottoman and German empires under the, quote, tutelage of advanced nations until they became independent. Britain was given the mandate over Palestine, but the Palestinian people were never asked what they wanted or what independence would look like to them.
영국은 팔레스타인에 대한 통치권을 부여받았지만 영국은 팔레스타인 사람들에게 그들이 원하는 것이 무엇인지, 원하는 독립이 그들에게 어떤 모습일 것인지에 대해서는 물어보지 않았습니다.
Listen to what Balfour wrote to one of his colleagues.
For in Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country.
팔레스타인에 대해서 우리는 여기 살고 있는 사람들의 바램 따위는 들어보는 것조차 하지 않을 걸세.
Instead, it was the Zionists who were consulted about what their vision for Palestine was. And so the mandate ended up incorporating not just the Balfour Declaration, but several clauses requiring Britain to ensure the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. British rule was very accommodating to the Zionist project. The Jewish community in Palestine grew with big waves of immigration. They had their own schools and factories and even their own militia, the Haganah, and they were led by the Polish-born David Ben-Gurion, the leader of their representative body, the Jewish Agency. To the Palestinians, it was clear that Britain wasn't delivering them independence. It was delivering their country to other people.
팔레스타인 사람들에게는 영국이 그들에게 독립을 제공하지 않을 것이란 사실이 분명했습니다. 단지 영국은 자신의 나라를 다른 사람들에게 뺏어 줄 뿐이었죠.
In 1936, they went on strike. British forces tried to break the strike with arrests, torture, mass punishment, and executions. Leaders were exiled, weapons confiscated, and houses blown up. Palestinian fighters attacked British and Jewish targets, while British and Haganah forces would carry out joint raids on Palestinian villages. Something had to change. The British government sent a commission called the Peel Commission to figure it out, but their proposed solution was typical. Just draw another British line on the map, divide the country, give this part to the Jews and this part to the Palestinians, and make that part of Transjordan next door. Oh, and because the Palestinians were a majority in the country, 250,000 of them would have to be removed by force to make the Jewish state viable. Remember, these were the proposals that were meant to calm things down. Spoiler, they didn't.
기억하세요. 이것이 상황을 진정시키기 위한 해결책이었다는 것을요. 스포일하자면 이는 전혀 상황을 진정시키지 못했습니다.
Instead, the revolt continued until 1939, by which time about 10% of Palestine's adult male population had either been killed, injured, arrested, or exiled. The British government really needed a solution. So here comes another report.
The commission is studying the 20-year-old Jewish settlements in British-mandated Palestine.
The 1939 White Paper created a conflict between the British and the Zionists for the first time because it rejected partition and said the solution was for Palestine to gain independence within 10 years, with everyone living there sharing it together. Crucially, it also imposed severe limits on Jewish land purchases and immigration. To the Zionists, this felt like a betrayal. In response, some set off bombs across the country, killing dozens of Palestinians. But soon, everyone was distracted by something much bigger. More than 60 million people were killed in World War II, including 6 million Jews murdered in Nazi death camps. Jewish survivors fled Europe, with a large number of them trying to find safety in Palestine despite the British limit on Jewish immigration. This set off a more direct confrontation between the Zionists and the British, with Palestinians often targeted as well. The Zionists knew two things. Militarily, they were stronger than the Palestinians, and Britain was exhausted by World War II, so it wouldn't have the stomach to keep fighting in Palestine. They were right. In 1947, after 30 years of occupation, Britain announced it was quitting Palestine and asked the newly formed United Nations to clean up its mess. All right, 1947 and 1948 are the most pivotal years in this story. So let's take a look at how things are lining up. During British rule, Jews had gone from 10% to 30% of the population and owned about 6% of the land. Under Ben-Gurion's leadership, the Jewish Agency was pretty much functioning as a government for the Jewish community. And the Zionist militias had tens of thousands of soldiers, modern weapons, and officers who'd already fought in World War II. On the other side, the Palestinians hadn't been allowed to develop their own administration or military. But as they waited for the UN solution, they were still the majority all over the country. In November 1947, the UN, then only made up of a fraction of the world's countries, voted to partition Palestine. This plan marked off 55% of the country for a Jewish state, but the UN never explained how it could be a Jewish state when half the people in its territory were Palestinian. To nobody's surprise, Palestinians, and in fact all Arabs, rejected the UN's plan. Ben-Gurion and the Zionist leadership accepted, but they saw an opportunity. With the British on the way out, the Zionists knew they would have the strongest military in Palestine. Their forces were instructed to seize more territory than they'd been awarded by the UN, and to do what was necessary to reduce the number of Palestinians in it. In cities like Haifa, the militia set off car bombs in Palestinian neighborhoods. They attacked villages and forced residents out.
Haganah troops have driven the Arabs out of the beleaguered city, taking many prisoners.
After inspecting parts of Western Jerusalem that had been emptied of Palestinians, Ben-Gurion said,
In many Arab neighborhoods in the West, we do not see even one Arab. If we persist, it is quite possible that in the next 6 or 8 months, there will be considerable changes in the country, and to our advantage.
서쪽의 많은 아랍 이웃들 중에 당신들은 한 명의 아랍인도 있지 않은 나라를 보게 될 것입니다. 우리가 이렇게 끈질기게 한다면 6개월, 8개월 이내에 충분히 가능할 겁니다. 확연한 변화가 이 나라에 생길 것이고 그것은 우리에게 확실한 도움이 될 거예요.
One of the events that helped speed up these changes took place on April 9th, 1948, when the village of Deir Yassin was attacked. A British government report to the United Nations describes the scene. 250 people were killed in circumstances of great savagery. Women and children were stripped, lined up, photographed, and then slaughtered by automatic firing. The story of what happened at Deir Yassin set off panic all over the country. As news spread, people fled, fearing they would be next. Historians have recorded dozens of similar massacres during this period. Each time, they would result in entire communities fleeing.
תמיד הייתה הוראה של בן-גוריון, לגרש את האנשים משם. תרשנו את המקום, טרקטורים עוד חרשו את המקום. חרשו. לא נשאר חשב פעם.
항상 명령이 떨어졌어요. 벤구리온이 하는 명령이었죠. 사람들을 추방시켜라. 우리가 한 지역을 점령하면 트랙터가 와서 다 밀어버렸어요. 전부 다 밀어버렸죠. 그 마을에는 결국 아무것도 남지 않았어요.
למה? לא רצו שתהיה, לא חזרה ולא זכר של המקום.
왜냐고요? 그들은 아무도 돌아오기를 바라지 않았거나 아무런 흔적도 남기를 바라지 않았죠.
By the time Britain ended its mandate on May 15, 1948, 250,000 Palestinians
1948년 5월 15일 영국이 통치를 종료할 때까지 25만 명의 팔레스타인 사람이 달아났습니다.
had fled. The night before, David Ben-Gurion announced the founding of the State of Israel, with himself as its first prime minister. He was standing under a giant portrait of Herzl, 51 years after Herzl had predicted this very moment. The Zionist militias came together as the newly formed Israel Defense Forces, but the fighting wasn't over. With the British out of the way, soldiers from several Arab countries entered Palestine, but the Israeli army was better equipped, better organized, and unlike the Arab armies, had a unified command and backing from several European countries. Israeli forces pushed into places that the UN had assigned to the Palestinian state, like the towns of Lidda and Ramle. 50,000 people were forced to flee from there, many on foot, in what became known as the Lidda Death March. After being emptied, the towns were given Hebrew names, Lod and Ramla. Like in many other emptied towns, the buildings and homes were taken over by the new Israeli state and given to Jews. By the time the UN secured an armistice, 3/4 of the Palestinian people had become refugees. In Arabic, they call this the Nakba, literally the catastrophe. The new state of Israel made up 78% of what had been Palestine. The remaining parts were annexed by Jordan or taken over by Egypt. A year later, the UN passed a resolution calling for all Palestinian refugees to be allowed to return home. They never have been.
1년 뒤 유엔은 모든 팔레스타인 난민들의 본국 귀환을 허용하라는 결의안을 통과시켰지만 아무도 돌아올 수 없었습니다.
Palestine had been erased. In the decades since, attempts to resolve this conflict have again tried to partition the land. With each successive attempt, the territory offered to Palestinians in their historic homeland shrinks even more. Ironically, Israel is still struggling to maintain the population advantage it gained in 1948 when it forced all those people out, because in 1967, it occupied the West Bank and Gaza, bringing all the Palestinians living there under its rule. And so today,
역설적이게도 이스라엘은 1948년 이후 그렇게 많은 사람들을 몰아내고 나서도 인구에 있어서 우위를 점하고 있지 못합니다. 왜냐하면 1967년 서한지구와 가자지구를 점령하고 살고 있던 모든 팔레스타인 사람들을 그곳에 밀어넣고 통치하고 있기 때문이죠.
the population of Jews and non-Jews in this land is roughly equal. But those living under occupation have no rights, no citizenship, and no prospect of independence. The Nakba-era tactics of settlement, home demolitions, and expulsion are still used against them.
우리는 나크바를 원한다. 우리는 나크바를 원한다.
Israel has taken the land but wants nothing to do with the millions under its rule. International, Israeli, and Palestinian human rights groups say this system is a form of apartheid.
세계 이스라엘 팔레스타인 인권 단체들은 이것은 하나의 아파르테이드, 인종 청소라고 말합니다.